Hi, I'm Bjorn, and I do movies. And welcome back to writing a dark Harry Potter murder mystery. Today we're going to do the first act, and as y'all can see, I'm still in London. I'm really there, and yeah, I'm gonna love with y'all. I'm a fraud. I'm not really in London. This is a lie. I pinned up a green screen behind my couch. I'm sitting on my couch right now. You can see it in the video, guys. No one's being fooled by this, all right? I don't know, man. I just can't keep up the level of quality content you want. Like, I'm stuck with this shitty green screen. I don't know. You know what? We're gonna do better. I know a place. Hold on. We're going somewhere else. Hold on. All right, this is where all the port keys for all of Wizarding, Texas are. The Outback Steakhouse sign, as you might guess, takes you right to Australia, which is you wouldn't want to go there. Lots of spiders and snakes and shit. This one, I think that one goes to Brazil, but you wouldn't want to touch that because Brazil, duh. And this one right here, this is the one we're looking for. This one's gonna take us right to the UK, which you also really wouldn't want to go to, but for the sake of the video, I'm going to. All right, without further ado. Looks like the spell worked. We are somewhere here out in the English countryside. So, without further ado, let's get right into the script.
All right, I'm going to call this movie Aurors, the Slayer of Thor. We're going to treat this basically like it's a movie, so I'll describe where logos go and title drops, things like that. I'm still recovering from my cold, so you might notice something is a little off with my voice. We are going to open on the Warner Brothers logos that turn into a dark storm with lightning flashes after showing for a little bit. The camera moves through the storm until we see the London streets. We move around them until we zoom into Diagon Alley. It looks much like how we remember it with a few changes. Some of the buildings aren't there because it's the 1970s. We see text that says 1971. We move into a Wizarding grocery store and see a woman paying for a bag of oddly undulating bright green fruit. The woman's name is Melissa, and she says, "Thank you, Miss Gelfrey. The Slabbergills are going to love these. They only eat fruit that moves, you know. A bother to find." Mrs. Gelfrey says, "Never you mind now. I'll always have stock for customers like you, dear. You best be getting home in a hurry. Looks like a storm is coming." Melissa says, "I will. Thanks again." We see the young witch step out into the alley. The streets are growing more empty as night falls and the storm approaches. As she walks down the road, we see a man slip into the alley to follow her. We see Melissa reach a store called Magical Menagerie, which appears a couple times in the books. She opens up the door and shuts it behind her. The entire building is filled with cages containing all sorts of strange magical animals. We see a few that we know and love and some others that we don't. She moves through the building to a tank filled with water and drops the odd undulating fruits in. We see the eel-like creatures inside begin to consume it. She begins to change the cage of another animal when she notices a man standing in the store. He's cast in shadow. When she sees him, she jumps a bit in fright. She says, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, but we're closed for today. You'll have to come back tomorrow." He doesn't answer her. Lightning strikes outside and illuminates his face for a moment. He's wearing a mask covered in strange symbols. It looks like it's been carved from stone. He holds a wand in his hand. Melissa asks, "What do you want?" The man holds up his wand. He says, "Imperio." A blast of light hits the woman and her eyes go glassy white. She lets her head tilt to the side and she lowers her arms to her waist. The killer says, "Up the stairs." The woman begins to move towards the stairs like a zombie. As she goes, the killer follows. We zoom into his mask and the screen goes black and we get the title drop. From the title drop, we're going to cut to a train moving across the tracks somewhere in the middle of England. We zoom into one of the train cars and we see 4 men standing around a small cage. As the camera pans, we see inside is a small golden bird with glittering long gold tail feathers. The bird is about the size of a songbird, but with like pheasant feathers that are golden. I don't know, something like that. You can imagine it. The first poacher says, "I don't understand what all the fuss is about. If this stupid bird is worth 500 galleons, shouldn't we just sell the thing and be rid of this whole mess?" The poacher's leader says, "It's a Midas bird, fool. It turns things to gold. It's worth far more to us than 500 bloody galleons." The first poacher says, "If it turns things to gold, why hasn't it turned the cage gold yet?" And the poacher leader says, "It won't turn metal gold. That's how it works." The second poacher says, "If it's as valuable as you say, shouldn't we be worried about the ministry?" The poacher leader says, the ministry has no idea that their precious protected bird is even gone. You can relax. We're nearly there. Suddenly an owl flies through an open window and drops the letter. It floats up into the air right in front of Poacher 2. It folds into lips. The letter says, Dear Aurora Reed Hawthorne, this is an emergency summons by order of the Minister of Magic. You are to cease your current operation and seek out a crime scene in Diagon Alley. This is a matter of grave importance. Good day. The letter rips itself apart, and all the other poachers stare at Reed, the newly outed undercover Auror. He says, Damn. The train car bursts into action. The bandit leader immediately pulls out a wand, but Reed is quicker. He yells, Expelliarmus! The wand flies from the hand of the poacher leader. The other two men quickly draw their wands and begin a fierce back-and-forth duel. Reed blocks their first few attacks before countercasting a spell. He yells, Depulso! One of the poachers is sent flying back into the side of the train car. He casts a spell at the other poacher. Confringo! The poacher blocks it with a counter spell, and the spell explodes on the side of his invisible shield. We see the poacher leader recover his wand. He points it towards Reed and casts a spell. Bombardo! Reed dives out of the way as a ball of fire erupts from the wand of the poacher. It hits the side of the train car and explodes. The explosion rips a giant hole in the side of the train. The third poacher is sent flying back by the blast. His hand slips into the bird cage as he tries to stand back up. We see him turn to gold. In all the smoke and chaos, Reed grabs the cage and moves towards the hole in the train car. He points his wand at his shoes and casts a spell. Kalushu! With the birdcage in his hand, Reed sticks a hand to the side of the train. He swings himself off and hangs by it as if it's stuck. The train tracks zoom below him. He sticks his foot to the side of the train and starts to climb up until he reaches the roof. He starts to walk across the roof of the train, trying to make it to another compartment, still holding the birdcage in his hand. Behind him, we see the poacher leader climb onto the roof. Reed notices and turns. He holds his wand out and they start a fight. It's spell after spell fired from both sides. They counter and counter-attack each other constantly, all on top of a speeding train. For a fun action set piece, you haven't really seen anything like this in Harry Potter. Mixing a little bit of an action movie set piece with the magic, I think it could be really cool. That was the one thing I always thought was lacking in Harry Potter, was the action. Finally, Reed casts a spell that the poacher misses. Diminudo! The poacher is hit by a vortex of swirling white light. He shrinks until he's about the size of an action figure. The wind whipping across the train roof is too much for him at that size. He's blown up into the air and vanishes. We see Reed let out a sigh of relief. He moves across the train with the bird. We're going to cut to the train pulling into a station. We see Reed exit with the cage. Two Aurors rush out to meet him, wands in hand. He hands one the bird. Don't touch it. I left one alive and one dead on the train. I have to go deal with an urgent ministry business. I trust you can handle this. The Auror says, we'll clean up. Reed says, all right. He walks a few steps, then apparates. We're going to cut to Diagon Alley. We see Reed arrive in Diagon Alley by apparition. He approaches the magical menagerie building, which is a crowd growing around it. A few wizards wearing ministry badges hold back bystanders. Reed makes his way through the crowd and into the building. Once he's inside, he sees two Aurors chatting in the front building. Reed asks, how long? The neighbor came to check on her this morning, around 3 hours ago when she didn't open up. She found the body. The victim was killed sometime in the night. Reed continues to move through the animal shop. We see squealing cages and strange magical animals zooming around their cages as well. Reed says, Myers, Smith, pointing to two different Aurors. Have you two canvassed for witnesses? Myers says, yes, sir. Reed says, and? Smith says, nothing, sir. No one saw anything out of the ordinary. Last person to see the victim alive was a local shop owner who didn't notice anything odd. Reed says, I thought as much. Go try one more time, see if we missed anything. Myers says, yes, sir. A young girl with red hair tied into a bun approaches him. She says, you must be Reed Hawthorne. I'm supposed to meet you. I'm Elsie Goldfinch. Reed says, I haven't seen you before. Elsie says, I'm new. Only been here a month. I'm supposed to shadow you, they say. Reed says, shadow me? Elsie says, you know, like watch you, see how you work. Reed sighs. He says, all right. Do you know where the body is? Elsie says, it's up the stairs. No one's gone up since the neighbor found it. We were told to wait for you. They say you know what to look for. Reed says, good. You come with me. He turns to the others. The rest of you stay here and keep anyone from the Daily Prophet out. I don't want to see this in the papers until we make a statement. He moves towards the stairs. The animals continue to squawk and squeal. As he moves up the stairs, the camera pans up and we get the reveal of the body. It's leaning against a plain white wall. Her arms are laid out and her wrists are Blood is in puddles around her. There's a hexagonal hole in one of the blood puddles, which is entirely dry. Most strange of all are the symbols that are drawn on the walls with blood. They look almost Aztec or Mayan. Reed approaches the body slowly. We see similar symbols drawn on her cheeks and her forehead too. They match those on the wall. Elsie looks like she's going to be sick. Who could have done something like this? We see Reed snap a photograph with an older camera. It has a bright flash. Reed says, "She'll have killed herself." Elsie says, "What?" He snaps a photo of the wrist wounds and the blood pools. She slit her own wrist under the influence of the Imperious curse. As she bled out, she drew these symbols on her face. But they aren't right. They're usually different. He takes a picture of the symbols on her forehead. Elsie says, "You've seen something like this before?" Reed says, "I have. This is the work of the Slayer of Four." Elsie says, "The Slayer of Four? I've never heard of him." Reed says, "It was before your time. In more recent years, the ministry tries to keep this case quiet. It's particularly gruesome. He kills 4 people every 4 years like clockwork. Always the same way." Elsie says, "Are all his victims women? I've read that a lot of killers like to target women." Reed says, "No, not this one. Men, women, even a kid once." Elsie nods nervously. She begins to look around the room, carefully combing over every detail. Reed notices her snooping as he studies the body. "You're wasting your time. He doesn't leave clues behind. He doesn't make mistakes." Elsie says, "But maybe this time he did. Can't hurt to look, right?" Reed just sighs and goes back to his work, ignoring her. Elsie continues to look around until something catches her eye. There's a hole in the wall. It looks like a hole from a nail. She reaches out to feel it and brushes up against something invisible. She looks startled for a second before she removes her wand. She says, "Revelio." A stream of golden light is released from her wand. Suddenly a nail appeared in the previously empty hole, and hanging from it is a glass vial containing a flowing black strand. Above the vial, a message written in blood appears as well. It says, "For Wallace Knotwood." Reed looks up from his work, noticing what she found. He says, "He left a message." Elsie says, "It was cloaked under a charm." "Good work, Auror. I wouldn't have thought to test for visibility charms. He has never left one before." Elsie says, "You said the symbols are different too. Are you sure this is the same killer?" Reed nods his head. "The staging is too perfect. Our man is clever and calculating. This here," he points to the dry mark in the blood. "We never release details of that to the public. This is our man. If he's changed the pattern, there's some purpose behind it." Reed's eyes look up to the message. He looks sad and confused in equal parts. Elsie asks, "Who's Wallace Knotwood?" Reed says, "An old acquaintance of mine." Reed looks at the vial and examines it without touching it. Elsie asks, "What is it?" Reed says, "A memory stored in glass. For a pensive. This is very advanced magic. I need to speak to the minister. She'll want an update." We're going to cut to the Ministry of Magic. We see the Minister of Magic, Eugenia Jenkins, doing paperwork at her desk. According to the Wikipedia, this is the current Minister of Magic at the time. She has literally no depictions of her character or archetypes, so I'm just going to kind of make it up as I go. She's sharply dressed and has her hair pulled up. It's beginning to gray at the edges. She's older than she used to be. She looks nervous. A woman comes into her office. Her secretary says, "Reed Hawthorne is here to see you, ma'am." He says it's important. Minister Jenkins says, "Let him in." She nods and leaves. A moment later, Reed appears in the room. Reed says, "Your owl almost got me killed, you know." The minister says, "I knew you could handle yourself, and I was right. More importantly, is it the Slayer of Four? Is he really back?" Reed says, "I'm afraid so. The work is unmistakable, though he changed his pattern some. I'm sure it's the same killer." Minister Jenkins says, "I thought as much, but I hoped you would have some good news for me. All these years, some part of me had held out hope that Wallace had been right the entire time. I want to be done with this nasty business for good." Reed says, "I'm going to get him this time. As I said, the pattern's changed. I think Wallace may have scared our killer more than we realize." The minister says, "It's a shame the fool got himself sent to Azkaban. We could use him right now." Reed looks at her knowingly and says, "We could still use him." The minister says, "Don't be ridiculous, Reed." He says, "I'm not. I need him, Eugenia. He knows more about this case than anyone. I don't know if I can do it without him. Beyond which, the killer left something for him at the scene." The minister says, "What?" And Reed says, "A message calling him out by name and a memory for a pensive. I just have this gut feeling that I need him." Minister Jenkins says, "You know what a hassle it is to get a wizard out of Azkaban?" Reed says, "I'm aware." The minister says, Are you sure you really want this? And Reed says, I am. I've given it a great deal of thought already. The minister sighs. Very well then, if you must have him, you shall. I can get him out of Azkaban, at least for a while. You'll have my approval as long as you keep him under control. But do not forget what he is. A dark wizard. Reed says, I know what he is. I was there, Eugenia. I'll keep him under control. The minister says, be warned, you might find it difficult. You know he won't be right in the head. He's been in Azkaban for 4 years. He won't be how you remember him. Reed says, I know more than most what happens to men in Azkaban. The minister says, well, yes, I suppose you would at that. I forget your business with the madman there. Reed says, I'll make do with whatever part of him still remains. The minister says, very well, you have my trust. I want this whole mess done with. Catch the man before the next 3 die. It's far past time that the ministry puts an end to this killer for good. Reed looks at her and says, what's with the girl? She says you assigned her to me personally. The minister says, she's new. A top recruit from her class in Hogwarts. Very clever. I see a lot of potential in her if she has the right teacher. I want her on this case until the end. It's about time she got her first real assignment. Reed looks at her with a cocked eyebrow. Are you sure about that? This case, it takes a toll. You know what this killer does. Minister says, and she will not. Not until it's done with. It will be a good test for her. Let's see if she has the grit for the job, as they say. She stays. Reed says, as you say. We're going to cut to the outside of the office. We see Reed exit it. He moves to a cubicle where Elsie sits. Her red hair is tied up into a bun again. She's looking at moving pictures of the crime scene, the same ones Reed took. Reed says, Elsie, you're with me again. She quickly stands up as if surprised and starts to follow him as he moves through the ministry building. She says, I am. And where is it we're going, sir? Reed says, Azkaban. Elsie says, Azkaban? You must be joking, sir. And Reed says, I'm afraid not. And please call me Reed. We're going to be working together. We're going to cut to Azkaban. We see a triangle-shaped prison in the sea. The camera approaches it, and we pass a few Dementors. At last we reach the building. The camera passes through the stone walls of the prison. We see Reed approaching a man sitting at a large, dark wood desk. He looks down his glasses at them. Ah, Mr. Hawthorne. Back for another chat with the mad? Reed says, not today. I have orders from the ministry. Prisoner release. He hands the man a letter. The warden says, prisoner release? Been a while since anyone's left Azkaban. Long time. Reed says, these are exceptional circumstances. We see Elsie looking around nervously. So it's not Wood, is it? Be careful with that one, Hawthorne. He's not lost his mind yet. Still as sharp as when he was locked up, I tell you. And Reed says, I will handle him. I always do. The warden says, very well. This all seems to be in order. 8th floor, cell 24. I trust you can find the way. Reed says, you know I can. The warden says, good. Very good. The key. He hands Reed a big rusted key with the numbers 824 pressed into the metal. The warden says, and this is also for you. He hands Reed a wand. Reed nods and then makes for the exit. Elsie follows nervously behind him. She says, are you sure it's safe to travel Azkaban without him? What about the Dementors? Reed says, the Dementors will not bother us, and I know the way. They move through a hall to a winding stone staircase. The windows are fitted with iron bars that are cut into the stone. As they climb, Elsie looks through one. We see the stormy ocean and a few distant Dementors. The camera pans through the bars and swings around, climbing the walls of Azkaban. The camera pushes into a different window, and we see Elsie and Reed moving past cells, worked into the wall. Inside a few, we see dark, scrawny wizards huddled in corners. From a few, we hear insane laughter or whispering. Finally, he comes to a cell labeled 24. He sticks the key into the lock and opens the cell. Inside, we see a man sitting on the stone floor. He looks up at Reed. His face is buried in a bushy, unkempt beard. Reed says, Wallace, you're going to come with me. Wallace looks at him. His eyes grow wide. He says, 4 years. It's been 4 years. He gestures to where he has markings on the wall, ones drawn all across it to keep track of time. He says, it's happened again, hasn't it? And Reed says, yes. Wallace says, why do you need me? Reed says, because the killer changed the pattern. I don't know what to make of it. Wallace looks up. He says, He doesn't do that. Reed says, he did this time, and that's not all. He left a message for you. Wallace says, show me. We're going to cut back to Magical Menagerie. We see the body of Melissa. The strange symbols are still drawn on the wooden walls above her. We see the shaggy Wallace Knotwood approaching the scene slowly. We see tears in his eyes. The symbols are wrong. Different. Could it be a copycat? Reed says, my gut says no. Too close to the original. Wallace gestures to the wrists on the arms. The wounds are self-inflicted. Reed said yes. She was placed under the Imperious curse by all looks. The marks in the blood here are the same as well. Reed gestures to the hexagonal shape pressed into the blood pool on the floor. Wallace says, we never released that detail. This is the same. The Slayer of Four. Why change the pattern? Reed says, I don't know. Wallace nods. Where's the message? Reed says, Mrs. Goldfinch here found it, hidden behind a weak self-restoring cloaking charm. Wallace says, I wouldn't have checked for that. Good work. Elsie says, thank you, nervously. Reed says, Revelio. There's a shimmer in the air, and the message on the wall is revealed again. Just as before, it says, For Wallace Knotwood. Beneath it is a small glass vial. Inside it, a memory swirls. Wallace says, a memory for a pensive. Reed says, yes. I take it you haven't watched it yet? Reed says, no. Wallace says, you know what it will be. Reed says, I suspect. You don't have to watch it. Wallace says, oh, I do. I owe her that much. I have a pensive in my home. I suspect our killer knew as much. Reed says, all right, Wallace. He sighs and holds up the wand he got from the warden in Azkaban. Wallace notices. He says, my wand. Reed says, I'm trusting you, but I need your word that you won't do it again. Wallace says, I won't. Clearly I was wrong. I've learned my lesson. Reed says, all right. He hands Wallace the wand. Wallace runs a hand across it. Reed says, I'll meet you at the house. I'll give you some time to yourself. Wallace carefully removes the memory from the hook. He turns and says, thank you, Reed, for giving me another chance. Reed says, don't make me regret it. Wallace apparates from the room, leaving only Elsie and Reed behind. Elsie turns to Reed and asks, who was he? And Reed says, an Auror, one of the best. And Elsie asks, how did he end up in Azkaban? Reed says, the Slayer's last victim was a Hogwarts teacher by the name of Aster Knotwood. I suspect you knew her. Elsie says, she taught me Muggle studies in my 5th year. We knew she died, but they told us she got sick. Reed says, it was an easy lie. We thought it might be hard for the students to understand that she died like this. He gestures to the body. And Elsie says, Knotwood. She was his family. Reed says, she was his wife. When he found out, he lost himself. He was so sure he knew who the killer was. We had a suspect who was near several of the crime scenes and never had an alibi. We never had enough proof. Wallace couldn't take it, so he broke the rules. He cast the most vile of the unforgivable curses and killed the man. Elsie says, and he was wrong? Reed says, maybe. We had theorized that there could be 2 killers. Who knows? Maybe he was partially right. That wasn't the point. He did what we're supposed to fight against. We're going to cut to Wallace Knotwood's home. We see him appear in the front yard of it. The grass is overgrown and a window is broken. He looks longingly at it. He walks to the front door and opens it. The inside of the house is even more decrepit from the outside. Dust and mold covers everything, and spiderwebs hang on the ceiling. Wallace waves his wand. Scourgify. The room begins to clean itself. The dust vanishes along with the cobwebs. The knocked-over pictures and decorations fix themselves back onto the wall. Lastly, the broken window is fixed. We see Wallace walk over to a photograph of a younger version of himself and a woman. It's his wife. He begins to cry as he looks at it. He sets down the photograph and walks to the record player. He smiles to himself as he looks at a record from the Loving Spoonful. He remembers the past. We're going to cut to 1966. We see a younger and clean-shaven Wallace sitting on his chair. His wife bursts through the door with a smile on her face. She's carrying the record we saw in the previous scene. She says, I found something extraordinary in a Muggle marketplace today. Wallace says, oh, and what's that? And Aster says, a record. You simply must hear it. She pulls out the vinyl from the sleeve and places it in the record player. She drops the needle and we hear the song Do You Believe in Magic by the Loving Spoonful begin to play. Aster smiles and begins to sway back and forth, lightly dancing to the music. She says, don't you see, Wallace? They still remember magic. They still believe in us, just like the song says. The Muggles never forgot about us. Isn't it fascinating? Wallace smiles himself and says, I don't know about all that, but it's a catchy tune. Aster holds out her hands, and Wallace takes them, and they start to dance. The camera pulls out, and we return to the empty house. He sighs and musters his strength. He knows he has to face what's in the memory. He waves his wand, and a pensive slides out from the wall. He opens up the glass vial and pours it into the water of the pensive. It flows down like black ink. Wallace submerges his head into the water. The ink forms the buildings of Hogsmeade. We see Aster walking down the cobblestone street. We quickly realize we aren't in her memories, but the memories of a man following her. He hides in an alley. Wallace looks at him and sees his stone mask. The man sharpens a knife. He's hunting for a kill. The scene explodes into ink and then reforms again. We see Aster leaning against a wall. She's quivering. The Slayer says, You keep resisting. Strong. Let's try this again. Imperio. A blast from his wand reaches her, and her eyes finally go glassy white. He says, Now cut. We see Aster reach for the knife. She's her own wrists, and we see Wallace watching. He bubbles with rage. He desperately studies the killer, hoping to find any clue. The man is wearing the stone mask, but unlike before, it isn't marked with symbols. It's just plain and gray. Even his wand is plain and undetailed. There's nothing of note about it. The killer speaks again. Draw the symbols. Asher begins to draw them in her own blood. She's seemingly unaware of the pain. The Slayer says, Now hold this. He walks up to her and hands her a stone hexagon with symbols carved across it. They match those we've seen on the walls. We see Aster die as she clutches the stone. The killer takes it from her hand and sets it in the blood. When he picks it up, blood is gone from the area it sat. It matches the strange shape in the blood from the previous crime scene. The killer stands up and then turns to face Wallace as if he knows he's there. He says, What do you think of my work, Wallace? The scene explodes into ink, and we see Wallace back away from the basin of water. He's breathing heavily in panic. Tears are flowing in his eyes. A hand touches his shoulder. Wallace wheels around with his wand in hand and finds Reed. Reed says, Relax, it's just me. Wallace says, He knew you would free me. He altered the memory to speak with me. Reed says, What? What do you mean? Wallace says, He spoke to me. Asked me what I thought of his filthy work. Reed says, You saw him. Was there anything else? Anything that could help us capture him? Wallace shakes his head, regaining his composure. No, I don't think so. He altered the hell out of the memory. I didn't even know you could do that. He blurred his own wand's design. Go, watch it for yourself. I need some time. He wanders off into a different room, visibly upset. We see Elsie watch him leave. Reed doesn't take his eyes off the pensive. Elsie says, You should talk to him. I don't know what that memory was, but it upset him. Reed says, There's no time. The Slayer will kill again. Soon. He dunks his head into the basin. We see Elsie move into the room Wallace just left to. She finds him sitting on a bed. He plays with a wedding ring in his hands. Elsie says, Hello, I'm Elsie. I don't think we really met before, but I knew your wife. Wallace stops spinning the ring. Elsie says, She was my teacher, one of my favorites actually. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry for what happened. Wallace says, So am I. So I'm going to help you. Quit now. Elsie says, What? Wallace says, I've seen your kind before. You're too nice for this line of work. You won't last. So I'll tell you what the others won't. This case breaks people. I lost my first partner to it. He left the oars after the fourth body. It was his son, an 8-year-old boy. Elsie says, You mean the killer always targets someone close to the oars? Wallace says, Always the fourth. He is a man of patterns. You might think you're safe this time because Reed is here, but Reed doesn't keep anyone close. Not a soul. It's not in his nature, so it'll be you this time. Elsie looks mortified. Reed walks back into the room. He's holding a letter. He says, We got an owl. The second body has been found. And that's where we're going to end part 1. Pretty interesting setup. We got to meet a couple of our characters and sort of get the vibe of what the killer is about, setting up the mystery. So the challenge begins. This is a whodunit, and pretty quickly we'll start introducing our candidates. So if you guys can figure out who the killer is, let me know below. If you have any theories or remarks about the script in general, let me know. Any other thoughts and feedback, let me know below. All right, let's go ahead and go into the outro.
All right, well, that was the first act. We did some fun stuff up here, and we set up a firm foundation for what we're going to do with the rest of this series, and I think we got a pretty good idea of what you can expect going forward. With that being said, I got to hike because I don't know where the hell I am.